This is a long walk. Where's Leah? Yeah, thank you, Leah, for inviting me back. It's always so great to be here, and it feels normal again. Like it makes life feel normal even when it's not. So thank you so much, and thanks to Adam and to Gwen and to the amazingly talented staff. I mean, I could stand here and talk about you all. I'm grateful for you. And I'm also really grateful to be teaching my co-teacher, Jess Walter, that he is here too. Thank you. I appreciate all this. Uh, let's see. I'm being a real coward. So many people are reading new work, and I've written this novel that I find charming and inventive and really interesting and lovely, and I have doubts. And I'm superstitious. And so even though I prepared all that to read, I'm not going to read from those. So if tonight, because I really prepared a lot, went over that a lot and read it a lot. If tonight you see like a little shimmer up here, these are probably the pages from my novel going, what the hell? Um, so instead I'm reading a story that was published a long time ago. Well, it's in my last book, but it's an older story. I've never read it aloud. Um, and I've abridged it somehow, so I think it should work okay. I want to dedicate it to our workshop, and they will know why. Um, this is also a little bit of a cowardly act, to be honest, because I'm sort of hoping that that dubious honor will make them kind enough to not mention how much I'm going to contradict some things I've said in workshop in the way that I've written my own story. And I guess I could also do another sort of sub-dedication to all of you. Again, cowardly act, because I timed this reading and my iPhone said an hour and 15 minutes, but I don't think that could be right. So I think it may go over a minute or two. But Carl has promised me he's only going to read for 10 minutes, so you'll be here. We had a talk. Okay, so this is called Two Girls Off Quarry Road. Everyone knew about Cleo Talmadge. At 8, she roamed barefoot among the dusty, troublesome Knutson boys from Quarry Road. With her cropped hair and dirty t-shirt and jeans, she was nearly indistinguishable from those tow-headed Finns. The Knutsons liked to shout out random guttural words that couldn't help but appear insulting, and she quickly learned to mimic them. She walked like them, too, lanky and insolent, tilted to one side with a wide, boy-like stance. But unlike the Finns, who considered everything one beat too long, hesitation was never one of Cleo Talmadge's flaws. In fact, she had a talent for disappearing. Like the time there was that drowning in the quarry, the sad end of some misconceived contest with a pair of visiting kids. Or the afternoon when the Finns set fire to the caretaker's shack while playing with their homemade explosives. All of them were rounded up. You bet they hadn't taken the chance to flee. But the only sign of Cleo was a plastic barrette the Finn's mother had given her, a pink kitten on a metal clip the boys had used to secure the fuse. No one ratted on her. The Finns said they'd found the barrette, but she avoided the quarry for a long time after that. The Finns weren't ever going to look up in time. Even at 8, Cleo figured that out. As she grew, Cleo's reputation corrupted further. She made people uneasy. She prowled yards late at night, teasing dogs into barking frenzies. Don Krepp, who delivered papers before dawn, caught her for a moment in his headlights as she perched on the low roof of an uptown garage. And well past midnight, a bone-weary visiting nurse nearly drove into Cleo as the girls scattered handfuls of pilfered apple blossoms across the empty downtown intersection. She was just a child, but although no one could prove a thing, it wasn't long before all sorts of irregularities were blamed on her. The theft of lawn furniture, broken bottles by the bank drive-through, rose bushes stripped of their blossoms, even missing gutters. Her parents were no help. Alicia and Tim Talmadge, postal carriers, the pair of them, their routes bumping up against each other. They left before 6 each morning and walked the few blocks to the brick post office, sipping on a shared mug of milky coffee. Side by side, they packed their mail bags, set up their routes together. On their days off, always coordinated, they labored in their pristine garden, shoulders almost touching as they knelt to feed roadies and azaleas. They tidied the garage, oiled door hinges, they starched and ironed bedding, put away preserves and filled bird feeders. They were minding a nest in the wind's path. Afterwards, they set the table, almost always forgetting the third place, until Cleo appeared, trailing mud and bits of gravel over their newly waxed floor. Little of their careful regard went towards the girl. They picked up her messes, washed her clothes, and fed her when she appeared. Beyond that, they were at a loss. After all, they'd known and loved each other since junior high, while Cleo was a newcomer, an interloper, whose presence in their union would always be a surprise, no, a downright shock, as if they'd never imagined they could be invaded. And although they went through the motions the first few years, the child upended their ease, and they could not help resenting her almost from her first infant squalls. To be perfectly honest, they were relieved when she began to wander, which she did almost as soon as she could walk, as if she knew right away she had no place at the bungalow built for two. Cleo simply appeared in kitchens, kneeling on a high counter, her paw on a cupboard, or on a back porch squatting over a planter she'd improvised as a potty. She might have been scooped up by social services, and most would argue she should have been if it hadn't been for her grandfather. Once the neighbors realized Alicia's father was Harry Kane, the contractor who built half the town and owned a good bit of it still, they dialed his number every time the little girl showed up. My brother Ed worked for Harry Kane, and according to him, Harry genuinely liked the little girl. They were friends of a sort. While Alicia had irritated the hell out of Harry with her endless industry, that tiresome juvenile romance, from the first fit Cleo pitched in his kitchen, he was won over. Her indifference to his own raging tickled him. No one else could approach Kane when he had his dander up, and you couldn't ignore the look of her, the lazy green eyes, that gold flyaway hair. She's a spitting image of Kitty, my brother declared, referring to Kane's first wife, a local girl who died from septic shock when Alicia was in grammar school. Kitty Kane's likeness embellished every one of the company trucks. Maybe it was that, the constant presence of Cleo's familiar image on those loud, brash trucks, always running across curbs and shearing off tree branches as they raced from the lumberyard to job site, that made her the obvious culprit for every local misdeed. In the end, though, even Harry Kane wasn't about to chase after Cleo. The girl amused him, but he'd been done raising kids a long time back, and he wasn't about to pick up the yoke again, attending to every busybody's yelping. She'd be fine if they all left her alone. That was key with the Kanes. Eventually, they all found their way out, even if it wasn't pretty. Except for the Finns, Cleo didn't have anyone she might call a friend until the 6th grade, when Katie Schwinger moved to town. It was Katie who kept Cleo coming to school, the teachers reckoned. She woke the kid up, one would say later, anchored her. Katie loved Cleo, another said. I don't think Cleo ever got over that. She let her guard down around Katie. Poor Katie. That was everybody's first impression of the new kid who'd come to live with her great aunt and uncle way out on Quarry Road, past the Knutson place and even beyond that of the quarryman's widow. The Schwingers lived clear on the other side of the quarry itself. Katie wouldn't have cared about the isolation. Like Cleo, she had been left on her own for most of her young life, so much, in fact, that she'd homeschooled herself, using the newspaper and television and the monthly bookmobile from the county library. As a consequence, she'd inadvertently advanced, testing well into the 8th grade, though she was almost a year and a half younger than the rest of them. Small, bespectacled, with thin brown hair and a noticeable overbite, Katie might have been an object of ridicule if it weren't for her serenity, a deep-set quality of acceptance that made everyone around her feel a little bit better about themselves. It was as if Katie had seen the whole of her life and set her shoulder against the task, the way a tired man might undertake a long walk home, and the rest of us were just easing by, albeit shabbily, in our old cars. Although most people applauded the Schwingers for taking the girl in, there was one notable exception. Katie's second cousin, Curtis Schwinger, a clerk at the courthouse, was upset his folks had become involved, intimating Katie's tragedy wasn't so clear-cut. Who knew, Curtis said, but that one day some released felon might come to claim her and take issue with the way the aunt and uncle had swept her off. I've seen her kind of people, he would say, conveniently ignoring the fact that he and the girl had blood between them. Every day he witnessed real bottom feeders shuffling through the courthouse, throwing tantrums in the holding room, stinking of piss and random venom. More than once he'd been called to subdue a drug-addled maniac, all that high-pitched wailing and feet kicking at the stale courthouse air. The hellish drama. They were all over the place, he'd learned, this subclass, cooking up trouble in their dingy country trailers and broken-down bungalows where day and night melded and horrible, nonsensical plans hatched. Just listen to the police scanner any night of the week, Curtis advised. Couple at Ernie's motor court, woman behind Valley View Apartments. These aren't simple burglaries being called in, you know. They're armed to the teeth, too, he went on. Sometimes they squirreled in weapons inexpertly concealed on their bodies, and Curtis had to actually touch them, shaking out greasy guns or sticky knives from the stiff folds of their gruesome clothing, and personally convey these weapons to the evidence room. Katie, he knew, had been whisked out of a notorious trailer park. He'd rooted out the paperwork and recognized the address. After a few beers at the courthouse tavern, he would worry about strangers arriving in the night, bouncing down the lonely potholed road to unearth the bundles of folded paper money he supposed his mother and dad still hid in buried tomato juice cans across the property, money he intended to inherit one day. He wasn't insensible either to Katie's friendship with Cleo. Look at the company he keeps, he'd declare, as if he were one of the lawyers he watched daily, the kind who make big points no one could dispute. He didn't seem to mind who was sitting at the bar. He'd spool out all kinds of baloney about the nefarious schemes of his schoolgirl cousin and her ilk. My brother Ed and some of the other fellows who drove Kane's big trucks frequented the tavern, and eventually one of them would steer Curtis off his stool and out onto Bay Street, where the smack of the wind off the water would stir him and seem to clear his head. He had an apartment in one of the Victorians 2 streets up, and no one much minded seeing him home. Better that than let him slip away, half howling about injustice. His parents had been roused more than a few times in the night, their kitchen table pounded and dishes rattled, as Curtis berated their blinkered judgment. His father would make him coffee. His mother would dish out pie. They did their best to soothe him. Then one night, poor Katie had awakened to Curtis cursing and stumbling around in her bedroom, looking, he later claimed, for his own belongings that had been his childhood room, another theft for which he held Katie responsible. As his appalled mother comforted Katie, his father sent Curtis on his way with an uncharacteristic sharpness in the elder Schwinger's voice that made it clear, to Curtis at least, who was welcome in the household and who was not. Despite all Curtis's worrying, Katie was a model child. She did her chores as well as any adult and without complaint. She had a heartfelt affinity for her relatives' animals, a dog named Stephen Schwinger, 4 cats, a tiny Nubian goat, and was more help than hindrance to the older couple. She gave them so little to worry about that they didn't mind Cleo coming around at all, despite the talk in town. They were glad, in fact, that their Katie had such a dear friend. She was such a homebody. The only time anyone saw Katie out on her own was either at the library or marching down their long dirt road to unload the mail. Usually she'd be reading a book as she walked, followed by Stephen Schwinger, that sideways walking hound, well past his prime. Every now and then, Cleo would be loping alongside or beside her. Then the book would be put away, and the 2 girls would yak it up as if they might run out of time while they still had so much to say to each other. To other people, Katie never said much about Cleo, except to repeat ordinary bits of common folklore she attributed to her friend's unique wisdom. Cleo says, she might remark at dinner, that soap is a kind of magnet. It pulls dirt right from your skin. Or Cleo says a howling dog on a still night means that someone is dying. Or Cleo says if you press an ice cube against a wood sliver stuck in your finger, it will poke itself out and you can pull it free, just like that. By the end of Katie's first year with her aunt and uncle, the Schwingers couldn't imagine how they'd live without her, or without Cleo either. The older girl liked to help Katie's elderly uncle with heavy work, stacking wood and forking over the rocky garden soil. She even learned a complicated bit of wiring from Katie, who seemingly could pick up anything from a library book. Together, the two girls redid Schwinger's frayed and overloaded electrical box. The old couple fell in love with Cleo despite themselves, and soon, like Katie, they drifted away when the conversation downtown turned to shattered bird baths or missing cigarettes or girl-sized footprints raising a tulip bed. Their friendship went on like that for a couple of years, until the November Cleo turned 15, Katie an awkward 13-year-old. Overnight, their worlds divided as Cleo transformed and conceived other more pressing interests. She was still notoriously unkempt, her pretty hair streaked with gold, always tangled, her clothes held together with bent safety pins, her nails, well, please. Yet remarkably, she was a kind of beauty, and the smell of her musky and faintly sweet flat out enticed. That effect was not lost on Cleo. As she moved through her teenage years, she discovered a new way to terrorize town. 1 year passed, another, and she discovered she could scare the pants literally off any man she chose. Her promiscuity was legendary. The city meter reader Hanson, the young baker Donadito, that jaunty shipwright, a third-grade teacher, the Czech plumber, the new doctor with the pregnant wife. That last one stopped her cold. The wife went after her with an antique gun from the doctor's collection, which fortunately for everyone had been poorly assembled and fell into 3 pieces before it could be used. In the end, she'd easily released the young doctor, moving on to a fellow at the beer distributorship, then to one of her old playmates, a Knudsen who would never get over her. All this time, Katie went about her own business. It was as if she and Cleo had had a talk and recognized that both of them had work ahead that required a temporary separation. Without Cleo around, Katie was alone more, but she didn't really seem to mind. She was winning awards in high school for her math and science, and people were starting to talk about her as if she might put the town on the map someday. She was that smart. Her aunt said Katie dreamed of being a veterinarian and even confided in one of the library ladies that she and the uncle were thinking of cashing in some bonds they bought decades ago. The Schwingers had been seen talking to Harry Kane, too, about a piece of land he'd long wanted to buy from them. An education like the one Katie deserved wasn't going to come cheaply. Katie wasn't ignorant of the expenses ahead either. She had a dozen projects in the work, a fruit stand, a summer pet sitting business. Yet somehow she managed each day to get back up Quarry Road in the cool late afternoon to take old Stephen Schwinger, the hound, out for a little meandering, stopping now and then in the middle of the empty, dusty lane to fill a collapsible bowl with water from an old soda bottle and wait while the old dog took a few grateful laps. Sometimes out of nowhere, Cleo would appear, and the two would walk a while like old times, oblivious to the world around them. Katie's aunt said later that that was probably part of the charm of the walks for Katie, the chance that she might see Cleo. Katie never judged that girl, the aunt said, and wouldn't let anyone else either. Cleo's on a mission, Katie would tell us, dead serious, as if Cleo was engaged in something more than teenage catting around, bless her soul. And yet Cleo might have gone on indefinitely, winding her way through town with a parade of one-night stands, romantic weeks, a giddy month, a missing weekend, one near violent surge after another, except for Davis Riddell. He arrived on a boat the way most trouble did in our town. A trimaran, way too big and grand to escape notice, all varnished teak and gleaming lines. At first they thought he might be some kind of celebrity, but no one recognized him. And he wasn't exactly hiding away. He drank with the others down at the Courthouse Tavern and was friendly enough, showing reticence only when a couple of the older Finns hinted they might like to come aboard his boat. Then the rumors began to shift. He was a drug runner, they thought, moving pot from British Columbia into the States, exchanging it for harder stuff he'd transport back up through the Gulf Islands to Johnston Strait, all the way up to some hidey hole in the back of beyond. No one paid much attention to pleasure sailboats up there. You could anchor in a jeweled bay and rendezvous with anything, a motorboat, a float plane, a kayak, for Christ's sakes. Well, what's he up to here then, I wonder, my brother said. No good, I'd bet, Curtis Schwinger answered from down the bar, his dull eagerness nearly killing the discussion. Nah, one of Kane's men said. If he's a drug runner, I'd say he's on vacation. Fellow's the most relaxed criminal I've ever seen. Always taking a walk or a bike ride, sipping coffee half the day at the cafe. You guys don't have a clue, do you? Curtis Schwinger said. He'd grown a little quieter over the years, but once he got a tirade going, it was clear to all his conspiracy theories had only become more entrenched, more terrified, meaner. That day his face was flushed and his right hand tapped erratically on the bar top. I spied that fellow the other night from my window, Curtis Schwinger said, leaning closer. 3 in the morning. 3 in the morning. Who's wandering around at 3 in the morning? There was a long pause along the bar as everyone considered. Then another one of Kane's men said, You spied him? You spied him? God, you're such an old woman, Schwinger. Who's peering through his curtains at 3 in the morning? No one knows how they truly met. Cleo might have been practicing her handstands one windy night, almost floating up and down the rocking boat dock, when Davis Riddell returned from one of his own late-night rambles. He might have seen her from a distance, dimly illuminated in the single light, and he might have done what no one had ever been able to do, sneak up on Cleo Talmadge. Or maybe he witnessed one of her vaults over a brambly garden hedge. Or perhaps on an empty moonlit sidewalk, the world asleep around them, their solitary past simply collided. My brother Ed was visiting the tavern, one of the last to call it quits one night, when Cleo and Davis Riddell wandered in together. The expression on Cleo's face was so uncharacteristic, he didn't recognize her at first. Gone was the private grin, the tilted chin, the half-closed eyes that, despite the appearance of languor, seemed to take in every little thing. The Cleo beside David Riddell had a washed, clean openness, an unfamiliar vulnerability that made the bartender grimace until he, too, recognized her. Your usual Cleo, he murmured as he turned to fill a highball glass with Coke and an illicit splash of rum. You have to make it quick. Just want to get a six-pack from you. That Alaskan if you got it, Davis Riddell said. He held a 20 in his left hand, and for the first time Ed noticed the man's right hand tightly grasped Cleo's. The bartender went to the cooler and pulled out the beer, slipped it into a paper sack and set it on the bar. While he made change, Ed caught Davis Riddell's eye. She's barely legal, you know, he said. The bartender turned to hand over a few bills, hanging on to them just a second longer than necessary. And a whole lot of trouble, too, he added. Davis Riddell smiled as he pocketed his change and picked up the paper sack. I'll take my chances, he said. Of course, they had to share the news with the others the next night, the drug runner taking up with Cleo, and it hit 'em all. A wave of yearning swept across the tavern, the youngest Knutson, the lovesick one, flailing hardest in its wake. I'm going to skip just a little bit here. See if we can do this. Cleo must have taken him out to the quarry. How else would he have found his way to the Schwingers? And he must have, because late one Friday, there was Davis Riddell sitting at the bar in the Courthouse Tavern, having a quick beer before he met Cleo. On the bar in front of him, he'd set down an old tomato juice can, a brand no longer available, piled high with the type of golden raspberries the Schwingers won prizes for. It was just the following Sunday afternoon when the Schwingers started calling around looking for Katie. She'd gone off for a walk with Stephen Schwinger in the late morning, and by mid-afternoon she still hadn't returned. Alf Schwinger, the old uncle, found the half-blind hound stuck out on a stone ledge on the town side of the Knutson place, howling into a bush as if he expected it to uproot itself and help him home. The uncle wondered if perhaps Katie had actually brought the dog home before heading back to town to pursue one of her latest money-making endeavors, and the old, confused hound had tried to follow. But it was Sunday, and Katie would have noticed Stephen Schwinger behind her, and not one bit of this seemed right. By supper time, with no sign of Katie, the Schwingers were seriously worried. They telephoned Alicia and Tim Talbage, disturbing a quiet Sunday supper of poached eggs and toast points. Cleo was standing with her grandfather, the Schwingers were told. Harry Kane didn't know where Cleo was either, of course, but my brother Ed was in Kane's side yard flipping hamburgers for the Sunday barbecue, and he weighed in. Try the Boat Haven, he told the uncle. Alf Schwinger stepped right aboard David Friedel's boat and knocked on the hatch, which was partially open. It was past 9 by then, a summer dusk, and although a thin line of light still lit the mountains behind the bay, night was clearly upon them. It was so quiet that for a moment Alf was certain no one was about. Then he realized that what he'd taken at first for a bundle of laundry balanced on the bunk's edge was the fellow's stocking feet. It didn't take more than another step forward for Alf to see the rest of it, and all the time his old heart was hammering. Where's Katie? They found them just before midnight, the moonlight streaming a path that led straight to them. 2 girls off Quarry Road, the police scanner reported. 2 girls lying almost in plain sight, nearly holding hands. A heart, a head, a full-on execution. The love-struck Knutson, an early volunteer, discovered them. The other Finns had to pull him away. He was raging so much they feared he'd kill someone himself. At first, the theory was that one of Davis Friedel's drug buddies had tracked him down and that somehow Cleo and Katie had borne witness to their reunion. Plausible, even likely, except it turned out that Davis Friedel hadn't been a drug runner at all, but a burnt-out musician with a trust fund, allergic to every possible drug, couldn't even take one for his insomnia. It was Harry Kane who figured out the truth. Turned out he'd been listening all the while to the tavern stories, repeated each morning in one rumbling truck after another. And he might have ended up in jail himself if my brother Ed hadn't intervened and got the police to Curtis Schwinger's right on Harry Kane's heels. Who even knew the old fellow could still move that fast? He had Curtis's throat in one hand almost as soon as he slammed across the threshold. Jealous of a little girl, Harry Kane swore, "You son of a bitch." It was bad blood, everyone agreed. It showed up in all kinds of families, even those with kind, well-meaning parents like the Schwingers. Those poor, sad people with all that bad blood running through the family. Ed told me Curtis had a cousin, did the same thing, killed his girlfriend, and would have gotten to his little girl too if he weren't so high he'd forgotten where he left the trailer. She got away that time. Thank you. And now the real deal, Carl Phillips.
Okay, hi. Thank you. First of all, where did she go? Oh, hi. Thank you for your reading, Adrienne. It's an honor to be sharing the evening with you. And thank you, Leah and Gwen and Adam, for everything. You're inviting me back and making everything so easy and wonderful. And my partner in workshop crime, Tarfia, thanks. And the workshop itself, it's been great so far. It's only been 2 sessions, so we'll see. But so far, so good. Seems to be working okay. All right, so I'm going to read mostly new poems, but I have this book that came out in February, Then the War, and so I feel like I should read stuff from it. But this afternoon, I reached the point of hating everything that I've ever written. So I'm just going to make the effort. So it'll be 10 poems at the most. I always think it's good to know what you're in for. And Is this fine? Is this mic working okay? All right. Okay, so this is called, it's called Vikings. The Vikings thought the wind was a god, that the eyes were holes. A window meant a wind eye for the god to see with, and at the same time through. I used to hate etymology. What's the point? I'd whisper. I was quieter back then, less patient, though more easily pleased. I am pleased to have been of use, I used to say to myself, after sex with strangers. Leaning hard against the upstairs window, I'd watch them make their half-proud, half-ashamed-looking way wherever, and if it was autumn, whether in fact or only metaphorically, I'd watch the yard fill with leaves, then with what I at first thought was urgency, though it usually turned out just to be ambition. I'd leave the window open, as I do now. If closed, I open it, then pull the drapes shut across it, which, of the many I've tried, remains the best way I know still to catch a wind god breathing. This poem is called In a Field at Sunset. When he asked if I still loved him, I didn't answer. But of course I loved him. He'd become by then like the rhyme between lost and most. I'm too nervous to say much in between poems, so I'm afraid I'll vomit. Not really. Just, I tend to say stupid things like I'm afraid I'll vomit if I say things in between poems. So this is called Fist and Palm. There are plenty who'd hardly recognize me now. I used to be that cruel, by which I mean I was frightened mostly, and now I'm mostly not. Joy, if only flickeringly, each day astounds me. The man I used to be dismounts, relents for a bit, before digging his boots, streaked with longing, my own longing, what I can't help, hard into my sides again, into the man I've become. His way of reminding me we've only stopped for rest, a short rest, some water, we've years to go still. He has his job, I have mine. Speechlessness is not an option, he whispers into my ear. He spits on the words themselves after, as if to make them stay, or just to make sure I'm listening. But I'm always listening, as I always obey. Isn't this obedience? These songs I've built from things too difficult to speak of? This poem is called That the Gods Must Rest. It's tricky because the font in this book is too small. I told the publisher it was. And they said, oh, you know, just wear glasses. That the gods must rest. That the gods must rest doesn't mean that they stop existing. Is that true? Do you believe it's true? I could tell it was morning by all the crows rising again from that otherwise abandoned husk of a car over there. So ruined, who can tell the make of it now? What color? Or maybe if being stranded on a wind farm at night with no stars to sing to could be a color. That color, maybe. The way an unexpectedly fine idea will sometimes emerge from what looked on the outside like the mind as usual treading water was the crows rising. A misleading clarity to the air, like logic. He only wants what he deserves. He deserves everything he wants. I deserve all I've ever built and fought for. We deserve our loneliness. Okay, we're almost halfway through. I feel faint. This is called Anyone Who Had a Heart. which to my mind is a song Dionne Warwick sings, but I know other people have recorded it. Anyone who had a heart. I know a man who routinely asks that I humiliate him. It's sex and it isn't. Whatever. For him, it's a need, the way brutality can seem for so long a likely answer that it becomes the answer, a kindness even. And I have always been kind, for which reason it goes against my nature to do what he says, but there's little in nature that won't, with enough training, change. After it's done, if the weather's good, we tour his garden, heliotrope, evening primrose. Proximity's one thing, he likes to say, penetration another. And I have learned that's true, though which is better depends. Whose life? What story? The relief of snowmelt or the flooded fields again? We go down to the stables to visit the horses that, when they were nothing, just shivering foals still, he once asked me to give names to. How long we've traveled, he and I. More like drifted, really. And how far? More black than all the sorrows and joys put together that I can remember when I try remembering, which I mostly don't. Now the foals, they're stallions. Call out fanfare, adoration. Like broken kings, they lower their heads, then raise them. I think those are, if I had horses, that's what they would be named, fanfare and adoration. Though I killed fanfare off in a poem recently, so he's gone. But adoration lives. All right. This is called Scattered Snows to the North. Does it matter that the Roman Empire was still early in its slow unwinding into never again? Then, as now, didn't people burst into tears in front of other people, or in private, for no reason that they were willing to give, or they weren't yet able to, or for just no reason? I've never stopped missing you, I used to practice saying, for when I need those lines, as I assumed I would, given what I knew then, nothing really, about things like love, trust, the betrayal of trust, and a willfulness that's only deepened inside me all these years, during which I can almost say I've missed no one, though it hurts to say it. Honestly, the Roman Empire, despite my once having studied it, barely makes any sense to me now, past the back and forthing of patrolled borders as the gauge and proof of hunger's addictive and erosive powers. But there were people, of course, too, most of them destined to be unremembered, who filled in their drawn lives anyway, because what else is there, to where the edges gave out. If it was night, they lit fires, presumably. Tears were tears. Okay, from the ancient Romans to surfers, with whom I have a long history. Surfers. Probably this morning's surfers aren't that much different from the ones I used to watch nearly 50 years ago, whose glamour seemed so much more fixed, more absolute from a distance than when they got too close, which is the fault not of myth, but of turning people into myth. I was a kid then, and they were more or less men. Soon they'd be men for real, meaning more or less boys. They rarely smiled at me. They never touched me. They mostly pretended not to notice me. The one time, watching them from where I'd hidden in a stretch of dune grass, I could see a couple of them with hands raised to their eyes, scanning the dunes as if searching, and I stood up, unhid myself, and I could tell they'd missed me. Toward nightfall, I'm a lighthouse, I'm a lighthouse, I'd sing to myself, but very softly, because boys aren't lighthouses, That's nonsense. Repeat after me. I could never have guessed at it back then, this second life. It was all I could do, just to be patient as they paddled their boards out again into the waves. Then they'd catch one, and flashing my arms, extended in front of me like the twin beams of light that softly they'd always been also, I'd guide the men in, to shore, then closer, as if there were a choice that summer, or ever, and I'd chosen, and I could almost still see it from here. Okay, there are 3 poems left. And again, I like to give you a gauge, where you stand, you know to think what. And I can tell you another thing, none of these 3 poems is in multiple parts. So, because people try to get away with that. So, soft western light. There are places where it's still possible to watch bees map a garden out with what used to be called industry in a language that feels each day less and less my own. But the dream of exile turns out mostly to have been a false one. Me cutting the weaker parts routinely away from what, set a bit more free that way, might more likely flourish. It seems it's better to flourish. To confine desire to what holds sweetness, how small desire would be. In the more reliable dream, but who's to say more true, I'm just a body like any other in the world, in motion. The leaves shift slightly as I pass beneath them. Not acknowledgement, but like that. It's as if they cared for me, or felt at least they should seem to care. I'll miss you too. All right, this poem got revised like half an hour ago. Seriously, you can see what's crossed out. And, Rehearsal. By then, the point of the forest was the getting through it. Then it lay behind them, all but its sharper details, flies licking at dried blood, I think, on a random tree stump, getting swiftly lost, its muffled bird song, too, that had come less, it seemed, from the trees than from beneath mostly, as if somewhere deep inside the earth. Maybe meeting you has been the one good reason I lasted so long in a world that must eventually not include me, I almost said to him. Past the forest, the shore, where the land ended, where briefly the waves hitting it seemed the latest example of how squandering momentum can become routine, while upon the waves, the taken for grantedness of shadow play seemed its own example, how one way to prove power can be to quietly assume it. Then, except for offshore, where the dark lay like defiantly a ship at anchor, everything was itself, as it always had been. They took off their shoes, their clothes. They swam out to the dark ship. I'm going to finish with this poem called Career. I know. Career. Long after the dark that the singing was for is over, some keep singing for a while, as if refusing to stop could change the fact of daylight, or could make what it felt like to sing hidden inside the dark, that part at least, stay. What is it with the dark, anyway, that the closer they get to it, the more some people seem to all but shake with expectancy, even those raised like us to expect nothing? What if all the truth is an overwashed sweatshirt, sometimes on purpose worn inside out? Yet the world's still so beautiful, he said. Sometimes, I whispered back, but barely, just in case he was listening. Sometimes it is. We were hours from nightfall. Everywhere, promises kept becoming apologies, our way of talking without talking about the leaves coming to rest finally against their own images on the water's surface. It seemed enough. We understood it might have to be. We sat and watched, and briefly, it was. Thanks.